Working toward a big goal can feel like pedaling a bike up a steep hill. Not only because it makes your quads burn and your heart rate spike, but also because you assume that once you've crested the hill, you'll be able to coast. On the other side of the uphill is a downhill, or at least a flat road, a chance to rest and enjoy the fruits of your labor. Now, as long as geography and urban planning aren't playing a cruel joke on your musculature and cardiovascular system, this is typically true of biking to the top of a hill. Working toward a big goal, though? Not so much. Crossing the threshold of a big goal doesn't magically transport us to a more comfortable or sustainable state of work. Even when our big goal involves engineering an operational breakthrough, a careful reworking of process and procedure to arrive at a new milestone, we're not guaranteed a rest. This is not, shockingly, an indictment of the Protestant work ethic or productivity culture. It's not a problem that's reserved for hustle bros or girl bosses. What I'm talking about here is just life and work. Now, pardon me while I switch metaphors. When I'm working on making my work better in some operational way, it can feel like reaching the top of a roller coaster and waiting for the car to be let loose to ride the track powered only by its own momentum. Click, click, click. My hands start to inch above my shoulders. I ready the scream that's half terror, half wild pleasure. This is it. I'm going to fly. And then, of course, something breaks. Or maybe it doesn't break, but there's an unexpected result. A system slows down, a process starts to seem inadequate, the market shifts gears, a new idea emerges, an opportunity presents itself. Distractions arise. In that situation, I think it's pretty hard to stay objective. The imagined future state of, I've made it and I can relax now, gets ripped away. And even if things are still good, even if the change is good, it can feel like failure. And when things feel like failure, it's easy to make things worse instead of better. I'm Tara McMullen, and this is What Works, the show that rethinks work, business, and leadership for the 21st century economy. Now, I'll tell you how all this applies to your own work or business in just a minute. But I want to give you a heads up that if you enjoy this episode, you're going to love this year's summer seminar. It's all about systems thinking and noticing how systems in work, culture, and politics can make it a lot easier to understand and navigate confounding situations. We're reading Sofia Samatar's critically acclaimed novella, The Practice, the Horizon, and the Chain, and pairing it with 6 explorations of systems across a wide variety of applications. To learn more about Summer Seminar and register with Choose Your Own Pricing, go to whatworks.fyi/summer or click the link in the show notes. Now, let's get back to that process roller coaster. I have been through this process many times over the last 15 years of entrepreneurship and self-employment, but Sean, my husband and business partner, had not. And so last year, I found myself needing to talk him through this nasty, if entirely normal, cycle. I told him what I'll tell you in the rest of this episode. There's no such thing as coasting when it comes to work processes. And that doesn't have to be a problem. In fact, it can be a huge asset. Sean and I started our podcast production agency, Yellow House Media, in August of 2019. By the end of that year, we had enough clients to keep Sean busy. When the pandemic hit, though, I thought for sure we were going to lose clients. Instead, they just kept coming. We hired additional team members, borrowed some labor from my other company, and made our operations more efficient. We continued to grow in 2021 and 2022. But 2023 was a tough year. We saw more client attrition than we had in the first 3 years combined. Now, the business is stable, but it was a classic case of feeling like we just about made it and then having that potential ripped away. Or, as my old boss used to say, we snatched defeat from the jaws of victory. At the time, and probably still now, Sean and I were both a bit tender about it. Now, even being immersed in that context, I was a bit surprised when Sean told me he felt like his procedures were a mess. Sean is an anarchist, which might lead you to think he's happy to fly by the seat of his pants. But that would be a fundamental misunderstanding of anarchism and Sean. Instead, he, and anarchism, tends to be very process-oriented. And I knew for a fact how much care and effort he'd put into figuring out how to work with our clients. His procedures are objectively not a mess. So, of course, I reminded him of this. But I wanted to get past that sort of pat reassurance and investigate the real cause of his distress. And it essentially boiled down to this. He has an ideal version of his procedures, and then he has the version of those procedures that's either implicitly or explicitly been customized for each of our clients. And there's nothing wrong with that, but it can be a lot to keep track of. What's more, our client relationships have a pretty long learning curve. Podcast production has a lot of moving parts, and managing those moving parts has always been part of our value proposition. We do our best to keep our clients from worrying about those moving parts, but the more aware of them they are, the better we can work together and the more creative they can be. And that leaves us with a choice to make. When we onboard a new client, we can either try to teach them the whole process at once, or we can start with a sort of minimum viable process and teach them how we work, as well as learn how they work over time. The former option is, frankly, overwhelming. We feel like we're doing our due diligence, but we just end up confusing our podcast hosts. The latter option means we have to deal with a bit of frustration on our end, but our podcast hosts end up getting to consistent production more quickly. So with all that said, Sean was feeling some friction. His procedures weren't a mess, but he felt like things weren't going as smoothly as they should be. Now that mismatch between expectation and reality is key. His unconscious expectation has been that he'll reach a point when he's solved all the problems, ironed out all the wrinkles, and documented his way to a business that runs itself. But no process or system actually works that way. Businesses and procedures can only be stable for so long. Everything in this world tends toward disorder. That's the second law of thermodynamics, after all. Entropy. Now, at this point, I will admit that I have no more than a pop culture level understanding of what entropy actually is. But here's how Nora Bateson puts the promise of entropy. She writes, "Mutual learning happens in the entropy. We need the confusion to release the new. This dance exists everywhere in nature. It is the swarm of confusion that becomes the grace of the way things come together." I love that last sentence. It is the swarm of confusion that becomes the grace of the way things come together. Now, another way to think of this is what systems theorist Danella Meadow calls the drift to low performance archetype. A system drifts to low performance when we think things are worse than they are. She says, as actual performance varies, the best results are dismissed as aberrations. The worst results stay in the memory. And that memory, our worst results, our perceptions of the system not working, influence the actions we take and the goals we set. Even our attempts at correction can create new problems and hasten the drift to greater disorder. Now, it's entirely natural for there to be a discrepancy between the ideal state of a process or procedure and the actual state of a process or procedure. Under the right circumstances, maintenance and care get everything back on track. But when the discrepancy is between the actual state of a process or procedure and the perceived state of a process or procedure, that's when we start to see the drift to low performance. It happens when the discrepancy is between reality and the doom and gloom we fear is reality. It happens between facts and dystopian fiction. So let me say again what essentially Nora Bateson said. Entropy isn't a bad thing. It's just part of life. But it can be demoralizing. So perhaps a better metaphor for describing what inevitably happens to procedures as we use them is evolution. What can seem like a breakdown is often just a natural result of an idealized procedure coming into contact with real-world conditions that prompt an adaptation. Now, the theory of evolution is subject to all sorts of confusion, but one of the biggest ones is that lots of people think that survival of the fittest means that the best or strongest or smartest survive. But that's not what survival of the fittest means. It's not fit as in fitness, it's fit as in match. The version of an organism that best fits its environment will be the one that goes on to reproduce and pass on its unique characteristics to another generation. Evolution is a process that only happens in relationship to the environment and its inhabitants. Nora Bateson puts it this way. The assumption is that evolution is a line, but evolution is in the context, in what we learn together, mutually. Evolution doesn't just happen. It happens because some organisms can survive in a given environment while others can't. That's why a polar bear can thrive and reproduce in an Arctic habitat while it would languish in the savanna. Conversely, a lion thrives and reproduces on the savanna while it would languish in the Arctic. Both are strong and efficient animals, but they fit different environments. The same thing happens with a procedure, especially one that is used by a provider and a client. A procedure tends to evolve to fit the needs of the provider, the client, and the environment the client fits into. If it doesn't, the procedure gets abandoned. Unfortunately, we often confuse an evolving procedure with abandoning a procedure. So what's the difference between letting a procedure evolve, even into something that doesn't much look like what we started with, and abandoning a procedure? Well, the difference is learning. When you abandon a procedure, truly let it go, all you have left is reacting. Stimulus, reaction, stimulus, reaction. But when a procedure evolves, things might get messy, but they're messy because you're learning. And as you learn, you adapt. You recognize when a change creates a new opportunity. You notice how adjusting a step or deadline makes things work better for a client. Evolution isn't a grand plan. Instead, it's messy and awkward. It's weird and wonderful. Of course, procedures in a business or team aren't purely evolutionary. We actually can assert a grand plan. What Sean realized was that he'd let some combination of entropy and evolution loose in the environment, and having learned from the results, it was time to reassert a grand plan. Now, the grand plan isn't a newer, better, more evolved ideal system. The grand plan is the rules by which the system can self-organize. That is, the grand plan guides evolution rather than offers the ideal the system evolves into. This is the key to long-lasting systems, processes, and procedures. Donella Meadows puts it this way: the ability to self-organize is the strongest form of system resilience. A system that can evolve can survive almost any change by changing itself. In this case, Sean had procedures to work from. He didn't need to reinvent any wheels or helical DNA structures. He didn't need to change the goal of his systems. Instead, he had to adapt the rules a bit so that his procedures could evolve in a way that benefited the whole system. So he made a foundational procedure document and then started to adjust it, client by client. The foundational procedure kept both the client's needs and the team's needs in focus so that as changes occurred, those changes couldn't overburden either the client or the team. Instead of feeling like he failed Standard Operating Procedures 101, he realized he was in a great spot and simply needed to take the next step. Holding tightly to what should be, or what was supposed to happen, or what used to be the case, makes it nearly impossible to adapt to a new environment. The thing to remember is that we're always operating in a new environment. A business grows, and we adapt. A business shrinks, and we adapt. The market, the technology, the team, the goal, the resources can all change, and we adapt. We can reduce friction and increase efficiency, but we'll always make adjustments. There is no glorious day when things just work and don't ever need to change. And in fact, change itself can be pretty glorious. Summer is right around the corner, and that means it's almost time for Summer Seminar. Summer Seminar is an intellectual oasis for creative thinkers and curious adventurers. It combines speculative fiction, big questions, and practical application. For summer 2025, we're reading Sofia Samatar's critically acclaimed novella, The Practice, The Horizon, and The Chain. We'll pair it with adventures in systems thinking and cultural analysis, and we'll apply what we discover by reflecting on the systems we create and encounter in our own lives and work. Summer Seminar is designed to fit into any schedule and explores critical thinking skills you can apply to any goal or challenge. To learn more, visit whatworks.fyi/summer or click the link in the show notes. That's whatworks.fyi/summer. Summer Seminar starts June 9th. As always, you can find a text version of this episode at whatworks.fyi, where you can also subscribe to get the What Works newsletter delivered straight to your inbox, free of charge. Today's episode was written, edited, and produced by me, Tara McMullen. What Works is a production of Yellow House Media, a boutique audio and video production studio that turns meaningful ideas into remarkable content. What Works is produced on the ancestral homeland of the Conestoga and Susquehannock people, and the Yellow House is located on the lands of the Salish and Kootenai peoples.